used in thousands of everyday products, including cookware, clothing, food packaging, textiles, car seats, you name it. And they are contaminating our environment and threatening our health, especially for the most vulnerable Mainers. Luckily, we have legislation proposed this session that would stop PFAS at the source, and this is a top priority of Maine's Environmental Priorities Coalition. We are thrilled to have the bill's sponsor, State Rep. Lori Gramlich, joining us later today. And kicking it off this morning will be Gail Carson, who is the director of the Buck Climate Lab at Colby College, and Sarah Woodbury, the advocacy director at Defend Our Health, which was formerly called the Environmental Health Strategy Center. Welcome to all of you. Next slide. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 8,500 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that work through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today's event. We will hear from each of our speakers and then tackle questions for all of them in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait to get your questions out there, though. You can send them directly to me, Kathleen, through the chat whenever they occur to you. You can find that chat by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen. I'll keep track of the questions and compile them for the Q&A at the end. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can message Will Sedlak through the chat and he will help you. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thanks again for joining us. Gail, I think you're going to kick things off, so I will hand it over to you.
Okay.
Actually, I'm gonna, yeah, sorry, Kathleen. I'm gonna just very quickly introduce.
Oh, fabulous, Sarah. I will let you kick it off then.
Who we are. So just very sorry. And I just got a message from Lori Gramlich if Will or somebody could help her get in. She's having trouble. Anyway, so just very briefly, I just wanted to introduce Defend Our Health. So if Defend Our Health is formerly known as the Environmental Health Strategy Center, we changed our name back in October. So those of us might have known it under that other name. So we work to create a world where all people are thriving with equal access to safe food and drinking water, healthy homes, and products that are toxic-free and climate-friendly. And we do that in a variety of different ways, including working with our friends at Maine Conservation Alliance and Maine Conservation Voters to pass good policy. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Gail, and she's going to give us a little bit of a science update here. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Kathleen. I'm pleased to be with you all today and to be talking a little bit about PFAS. My name is Gail Carson, and I teach in the Environmental Studies program at Colby College. And in my work, I have taught a course for 15 years on chemical pollution in the environment and the human health impacts, including, of course, PFAS chemicals. And I've also done some environmental monitoring of PFAS in the local environment, which I'll talk a little bit about. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about kind of the science of PFAS and where it is and why it's a threat, and then I'll pass it back to Sarah. So PFAS is an acronym that stands for a chemical family name that we don't need to talk about, but it is a very large chemical family of some 4,700 different chemicals that are all related by nature of the fact that they contain carbons and fluorines. And that's about all the chemistry you really need to know. But they are often called fluorocarbons or fluorinated chemicals. And it might seem arbitrary. Why fluoro? Why fluorinated? The chemistry of carbon fluorine bonds makes them very high performance chemicals that are very, very useful in a number of different applications. And the ones that we're most familiar with are things like making consumer products or industrial products waterproof, water resistant, stain resistant, or grease resistant. So that by nature of that fluorocarbon chemistry, these chemicals are very useful to do that. And if they were completely benign chemicals, we wouldn't worry about it. We'd maybe be happy that we were using them in industry. But unfortunately, they are highly problematic chemicals. So they are in products that we use every day. So everyday people are coming into contact with PFAS in consumer products, all the time. And I'll talk specifically about which chemical or which products in a minute. But because of that, nearly every American has detectable PFAS in their blood. And we know this because the US CDC does regular monitoring of human body burdens, the amount of, foreign chemicals that are present mostly in urine or blood serum in a sample of Americans. And it's a very large study, so it's very statistically robust. And for the small subset of PFAS chemicals that they're actually looking for in Americans' blood, they're finding them in just about everybody. They are not looking for all 4,700 of them, so just a small subset, but some of the ones that are the highest priority and the ones that we know are in a lot of products and are contaminating the environment. So that indicates that these chemicals have the ability to bioaccumulate. They can build up in human bodies, and they also build up in animals and plants as well. Again, if they were completely benign, we wouldn't worry about them, but they're very, very hazardous. So there are a number of health effects of PFAS exposure that scientists feel very comfortable associating. And some of the work that has been done on the hazards of PFAS have been done on populations that have been highly exposed because their drinking water was contaminated with high levels of PFAS. So there was a study of people who live near a DuPont chemical plant in West Virginia that was making some PFAS chemicals as well as Teflon, which is one of the products that is made out of PFAS, which I'll talk about in a second. And their drinking water was highly contaminated. And they actually received a large settlement from DuPont in a class action lawsuit, and they used the money to do a health study. And the health study linked PFAS exposure to at least 6 different health outcomes, and it included 2 different types of cancer. It included metabolic conditions like high cholesterol and ulcerative colitis and thyroid disruption, as well as an increased risk of preeclampsia in pregnant women. It is also associated with birth defects if fetuses are exposed in utero. It interferes with normal brain development in fetuses and in children. It is associated with fertility problems. Numerous hormone pathways in the body are disrupted by PFAS. And then one of the ones that you may have read a little bit more recently, one of the effects is immunosuppression. So PFAS suppress the immune system of children and adults, and this is something that the US government acknowledges is an unfortunate health hazard. And there were numerous headlines over the last year about the intersection between PFAS exposure and COVID, actually, because high levels of PFAS interfere with the efficacy of vaccines and also suppress immune systems. So there's been some preliminary work looking at whether or not people with high body burdens of PFAS actually are at higher risk for COVID. So there's just a whole host of health problems. Next slide. So not only are PFAS bioaccumulative, meaning that they build up in the body, but they're also very toxic, as I mentioned. And then They have two other properties that are really problematic. And one is that they're very, very persistent. In fact, internal documents, from the manufacturers, which include DuPont and 3M, the 3M Corporation say, these chemicals basically don't break down. They have extremely long half-lives in the environment, and they are resistant to a lot of breakdown pathways that other chemicals in the environment are subject to. So once they're out in the environment, they persist for a very long time, and it's very difficult to clean them up. So that's why they are dubbed forever chemicals, because they, once they're out there, which is really problematic. The other characteristic that PFAS have is that they're very mobile in the environment. So once they're in the environment, they can actually move primarily through water and soil, and they can also move in air currents. So they can be produced in one location and travel on air currents long ways away. So we even see PFAS contamination in Arctic areas where there's no, where there's no production and probably very little use. So almost everywhere you go looking for PFAS, you find them, including in water, lots of drinking water samples, including here in Maine. I was just looking at the levels that are in the drinking water in Waterville, Maine, where I'm located, and there's PFAS there. There's widespread soil contamination, and some of these contamination sites have been specifically impacted by a local use of something that is in, something that had PFAS in them. And then other places where there's contamination, the PFAS may have entered that environment just because of global use and the movement of them around the world. So there's both local and global sources that are we need to consider when we're trying to figure out how to deal with all of this PFAS. Okay, so the next slide. Oh, okay. So I think we're going to transition to Sarah, and she's going to talk specifically about Maine's problems with PFAS contamination.
Gail, did you want to mention your ski area study really quick?
Sure. So I can start here. So one of the things, so PFAS are in so many different products. There was a paper that came out last year that identified over 200 uses of 1,400 PFAS. They're everywhere, from, again, waterproof coatings on your outerwear to, Teflon nonstick pans to grease-proof food packaging. And they're in firefighting foams and cosmetics and things that you wouldn't even think about, like guitar strings and recreational climbing ropes and paints and brake fluids and the plastic on the turf fields. I mean, it's everywhere. But one additional type of product that has PFAS in it is ski wax. And so I did a study where I looked at our local Nordic ski area, which is called Quarry Road Trails. Maybe some of you have been here, right here in Waterville, and looked to see where contamination might occur because of the use of fluorinated ski wax, which is has been used because it provides kind of a water barrier under the ski. And so your ski can really slide or glide across the snow, especially in warmer conditions. So I tested snow and soil and water at this place immediately after a ski race where we knew fluoro ski waxes were going to be used, and then came back a couple months later to look at contamination. And the bottom line is that this use of fluorocarbons is introducing enormous quantities of ski wax to snow. And it's true, anywhere skis and snowboards are being used. So it's a widespread problem. And we also found that the longer chain, the larger PFAS chemicals, actually, once the snow melted, they kind of stayed in the soil near where their contamination was found. But the smaller PFAS that we were also looking for migrated into the groundwater at this site. So this is just one example. And ski wax use is a small, small fraction of all of the uses of PFAS, but it's something that we need to think about. The good news on that, the last thing I'll say, is just that fluorocarbon ski waxes are being phased out. So we can actually make a decision, and this is supported by competitive sports and, pretty much in businesses, everybody's supporting this particular phase out. So that's actually the good news. And then I'll let Sarah talk about some of the other places that are contaminated.
Sure, thanks, Gail. And as Gail mentioned, the PFAS is ubiquitous. It's in a ton of products. Maine is actually kind of having a little bit of a serious PFAS contamination here in the state. I'm sure most of you have seen the stories about Stone Ridge Farm. This is the dairy farm that is in Arundel, Maine. It's a 100-year-old dairy farm. It has been in Fred and Laura Stone's family for generations. Because of sludge spreading, the Stone Ridge Farm has contaminated PFAS, and so their dairy products got contaminated, their land got contaminated, and the farm itself is basically at this point destroyed from like a farming perspective. Their soil is just a mess. They have massively high levels of PFAS there, and the reason that their farm was contaminated is, like I said, from sludge spreading. And so this was a state sanctioned process, generally kind of more in the late, the 90s and the early 2000s, although it is still going on. And to be clear, it wasn't just a Maine thing, like states across the US have done this, where it was kind of billed as a, environmental help to municipalities. It saved the farmers money. And so the farmers used the sludge, which are basically biosolids, and spread them on our farmland. It was a cheap form of fertilizer for them. It helped the municipality save money because then they didn't have to landfill it. And to be clear, the farmers did not know the PFAS was in the sludge. The municipalities did not know that the PFAS was in the sludge. But the sludge got spread over Stone Ridge Farm, kind of decimated that farm. There are an additional, over about 500 sites in the state of Maine where sludge has been spread. To be clear, not all of them are still farmland or were farmland at the time, but that sludge has been spread kind of all over the state. So, and testing has not been done on these sites yet. So we have no idea how big the problem is from the sludge spreading perspective. We also experienced some contamination in some well water in Presque Isle. There was a school in Trenton that had levels of PFAS that were higher than what would be allowed in Vermont and Massachusetts. And so there's some, drinking water spots. There was a trailer park in Holton. So there are, spots across the state where we have some drinking water issues. And then kind of fast forward a little bit, we also have the Tozier Farm, which I'm sure folks have heard of. This is the farm in Fairfield, where once again they spread sludge on their farmland, and it contaminated their farm. And they had some of the highest numbers seen in North America of PFAS in their milk. They have shut down. They are not selling their milk anymore, obviously. And the other issue with the Tozier Farm is that it's, as Gail mentioned, this stuff is very mobile. And so it got into the soil and it got into the drinking water of the wells around the farm. And so there are about 54, that was the last count, of contaminated wells around the Tozier Farm. The DEP is still doing testing on other wells around that area. So that number will probably increase. And additionally, at a meeting of the Bureau of Environmental Protection a couple of days ago, the DEP reported to the BEP that they are investigating some areas in Benton and Unity Township where similar sludge that was spread to what was spread on the Tozier Farm has been spread on land in Benton and Unity Township. They anticipate to see numbers similar to what they saw at the Tozier Farm. So this is an ongoing problem that we're still learning about across the state. And it's terrifying for the farmers. Nobody wants to find out that their farm has been contaminated with PFAS. So we need to do things, put some policies into place that can help these folks kind of move forward. And so I want to, if I can get my PowerPoint thing to move forward here. It's decided to freeze, which is great. So I want to talk a little bit about, so I'm going to stop sharing and then try this again and see if I can get it to go. Because I know that we have slides on there that Lori also needs to see. So let me go back to this. My apologies for the technical difficulty. So I'm just going to kind of leave it like that so I can mess around with it. So what are we doing? And when I say we, I don't mean just us at Defend Our Health, although we have been working on this issue for a number of years. I mean the state, I mean other advocacy groups, I mean the legislature. What are we doing to help folks and to deal with contamination? So as I mentioned, DEP and the Department of Ag are all doing testing. DEP is doing testing of well and well water, soil. DCAF is doing testing of farmland products, dairy, that type of stuff, to try to get a handle on the scope of the contamination. The DEP also has a bill that will be before the Environment and Natural Resources Committee on Monday that would designate PFAS as a hazardous substance. This is important because that will allow them to access funding for cleanup and remediation. So if folks want to engage on that bill, that's an important bill to get passed. The bill sponsor there is Jessica Fay. Hopefully folks saw in the paper, the governor had sent a letter to the congressional delegation, the federal congressional delegation, so Senators Collins, King, and Representatives Pingree and Golden, urging them to get federal funding for cleanup and testing and all sorts of other stuff. And that's very important. It's very expensive. Cleanup is very expensive. Fred's farm alone is probably millions of dollars to clean up. So we need some money from the feds. At the end of the day, the folks that should be paying to clean it up are the folks that created this problem, which are the chemical companies. But until that happens, we do need federal assistance for the farmers and municipalities and other folks with drinking water issues that are impacted by this. Additionally, in Maine in 2019, we passed a law that Defend Our Health worked on, a food packaging law that requires the phase out of the use of PFAS in food packaging. So once alternatives are discovered, then the state will no longer be allowed to sell food packaging that has PFAS in it. So, you won't be able to go to a grocery store and get, food packaging that you get there won't have PFAS in it. So that's being phased in over time. And so that's a good thing because that's a main source of contamination, particularly for children. So we're getting it out of the food packaging. One of the other important things is updating the statute of limitations. So currently in the state of Maine, if you have PFAS contamination, you have to seek kind of justice within 6 years of when the contamination happened. For folks like Fred and Laura Stone, for the Toziers, for the folks in Fairfield whose wells are contaminated, that contamination sometimes happened 20 or 30 years ago and they just found out about it. So we want to update the statute of limitations to where they have 6 years from the discovery of the contamination, so that folks can seek some help and some money from the folks that are responsible for this. That bill has had a hearing. It will have a work session next week. It's got really broad bipartisan support. So we're hopeful that that will pass, and the governor's office supports that legislation. We are also working to set a maximum contaminant level for PFAS in water. Right now, there is not one. Federal government does not have a standard. They have an advisory level at 70 parts per trillion. That is too high. That is not health protective. We want to follow the kind of lead of our neighbors in Massachusetts and Vermont, who set a much more health protective of 20 parts per trillion for PFAS in water. And so we'll have a piece of legislation. I believe we're working with Representative Kluker on that bill to get a more health protective maximum contaminant level for PFAS in water. And additionally, we have a piece of legislation with Representative Gramlich where it will require the DEP to test the sites where sludge has been spread, with a focus on the places where sludge has been spread that was similar to like the Toziers and Fred Stone. So something that was done like in the late 90s and the early 2000s, we'll prioritize those sites and then kind of go out from there. But at the end of the day, the thing that we can do the most to help is to stop the contamination at its source. And so our big piece of legislation that we're working on with Lori Gramlich will do just that. So I am actually going to turn this over to one of our legislative champions, Representative Gramlich, and let her talk about the bill that she is working on in the legislature.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Sarah. And really just pleased to be here. I'm sorry I was a little bit late. I was tangled up in the Human Services Committee trying to save the world on that end. But I'm just really pleased to be here. And I just really want to thank the Environmental Priorities Coalition for this wonderful opportunity to elevate this really critically important issue. I know you've heard about the dangers of PFAS, both on our environment and on our public health. I just want to let folks know a couple of things about me. I am by profession a licensed master social worker. I've been working in the public policy arena affecting systemic change, mostly in the social service world for, my goodness, I dare say nearly 40 years. And it has always been my passion. I'm in my second term in the legislature and serving again for my second term on the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. And so last session, when I was really kind of taking a deep dive into these issues, I was really quite alarmed to learn about the real dangerous health implications that PFAS has, certainly, again, not only on our public health, but on our environment. And I quite frankly see this as an environmental justice issue, because we know that vulnerable populations are more adversely impacted, particularly low-income communities, communities of color, tribal and rural communities. There's real implications, as we've heard all afternoon, about the impact that PFAS has on our health and our financial implications. So we know it's everywhere, right? We know Gail talked about it being in ski wax, and I watched a documentary, and I'm almost afraid to say it out loud. It's even in dental floss, which it is everywhere. But we now know about it. We've known about it for quite some time, and we're learning about the real health implications that PFAS has. It's widespread, cleanup is expensive, it's used in tons and tons of everyday products, cookware, clothing, food packaging, textiles, car seats. We could substitute PFAS for other products that are safer for the environment and certainly safer for our public health. We really need to break the cycle of contamination and cleanup by phasing out PFAS in consumer and industrial products. I know Sarah mentioned another piece of legislation that I've been working with Defend Our Health on in terms of cleaning sludge and making sure that PFAS is out of sludge and certainly out of our groundwater and our land, which is critically important. Water is a really very important issue that I've been spearheading in my tenure in the legislature, so I feel very, very strongly about that. I also just want to mention, as an aside, I have a piece of legislation in that would ban the use of PFAS in firefighting foam. We know that we have increased rates of various cancers for firefighters, due in part to the PFAS that's utilized in firefighting foam. And we also, again, know that there are alternatives. So we have to stop toxic PFAS really at the source so that we can protect Maine people and our environment. So what do we do about that? Well, the bill that Sarah referenced that I have submitted is still in the revisor's office. I'm waiting for my final draft, but the title of the bill is an act to stop PFAS pollution, essentially. And it would require that manufacturers disclose PFAS use and pay a reporting fee. Reporting fees would fund an at-source reduction program to provide technical assistance and education, grants to publicly owned treatment works and municipalities to reduce PFAS from entering the waste stream. And that's really, really important. This would both reduce contamination and put some of the cost where it belongs on the manufacturers of this toxic chemical. Because we know this chemical doesn't break down, we know it doesn't go away, which is all the more reason why we need to really stop it at some of its sources, which in this case and with this bill is the manufacturers. So we're looking at it from a phased out approach, so that we would phase out the use of PFAS in non-essential products. So the bill would ban the use of PFAS in carpets, rugs, fabric treatments, etc. by 2023. Major manufacturers and retailers who already are taking action to address this are doing so voluntarily, and we're very pleased about that. The law grants authority to the Department of Environmental Protection to ban the use of PFAS in other categories of products where alternatives are already available. So this particular bill would aim to get to that pocket of folks in the industry that aren't already voluntarily addressing this. Again, further phasing in would be prohibiting the sale of products containing intentionally added PFAS unless the Department of Environmental Protection has specifically designated the use of PFAS as currently unavoidable. And I'm hoping that that would be by 2030 that we would implement that phase. And I quite frankly am hoping that we can address that second part of it at some point in our future in terms of how the department has designated the use of PFAS as currently unavoidable. I'd like to avoid it entirely if we're able to. So that's a little bit about my bill that I've put in. I think it's really critically important that we support addressing this forever chemical. We've heard, I'm sure we've heard in the news for a number of years, but certainly during the past 35 or 40 minutes that this chemical has significant adverse implications, again, on our public health and our environment. For me as a social worker working in the social service arena my entire life, this is just a natural extension for me to continue this fight to address environmental injustices. It's incumbent upon all of us that we do every single thing that we can to assure that we are leaving this planet in a better place than we found it. And I know for myself and probably many of you, I know that I have less in my windshield than I have in my rearview mirror. I know I have a lot more in my rearview mirror, so that means I got a lot less time ahead of me to do this work. And we have to do this obviously for ourselves and our planet, but we need to do it for our young people, and we need to do it for our future, and we need to act now. So I really appreciate the opportunity, and I will do everything I can to continue to be a champion, if that's what you want to call it, to address this. But for me, it's an extension of the work I've done my whole life as a social worker. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Representative Gramlich. Before I turn it back over for Q&A, if I can get, I am just having the worst time with my PowerPoint. There we go. So I just wanted to flag a couple of things that folks can do to help us, push forward this piece of very important legislation. As Representative Gramlich mentioned, there is no bill number yet. We're still waiting to get it back from the reviser's office, but that doesn't mean that folks can't start reaching out to their legislators. So you can talk to your legislator, ask them to support legislation that phases out the use of, unavoidable use of PFAS. And then in particular, if you have members on the Environment and Natural Resources Committee, or even if you don't, reach out to them and let them know that you want to see this bill pass through committee with bipartisan support. We really would like to see that. If you're interested in testifying on this particular bill or any of the other bills I mentioned, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I can be helpful with talking points and whatever. Would love to see some folks submit written and oral testimony. Submitting LTEs to your local newspaper. Once again, if that's something you're interested in, we can be helpful. You can sign up for emails from us. You can go to our website at defendourhealth.org and we can keep you in the loop. And also talk to your friends and families about the dangers of PFAS. My friends are kind of sick of me talking about how they need to all get rid of their Teflon coated cooking utensils, but I would like to help them keep from getting horrible cancer or that type of stuff. So educate your friends and family on the dangers of these types of toxic chemicals and to move away from using them wherever possible. So with that, I will stop.
Can I just add a piece to your call to action, if you don't mind? I really, again, want to underscore the importance of reaching out to our elected officials. One of the things I didn't mention before I became a member of the legislature in 2018, I had been a lobbyist doing advocacy work on behalf of vulnerable populations in the State House in Augusta. And so quite often now I continue to wear my advocacy hat, and I really want to, now I can look at it through the lens of a legislator as well. It's really, really important and effective that our legislative colleagues hear from members of the public. And I just really want to underscore the importance of that, because you all have that lived experience. And that's really important for folks to hear your stories about the implications of any issue, but certainly when we talk about what's happening with these forever chemicals and the implications that it has on our environment, I think it's just really important to elevate your stories. And I just really want to encourage you to do that.
Great, thanks so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Kathleen to run the Q&A session.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Representative Gramlich. Advocates like Gail and Sarah and I tell people all the time to reach out to their lawmakers. It is really nice to hear it from one of those lawmakers, and we really do appreciate that sort of insight that the voices of real Maine people matter a lot in the legislature, as long as we make them heard. So thank you. And later this afternoon, everybody who registered for today's program will get a follow-up email with a link that makes it really easy to send a message directly to your state representative and your state senator. Also in that email is the Environmental Priorities Coalition's fact sheet about this bill. Sarah's contact information is on that fact sheet, so it'll be really easy for you to reach out directly to her with any questions. And of course, you can always count on us to keep you posted as this bill makes its way from the revisor's office to the legislature. We'll let you know when there's an LD number and all of those good things. You know, I just want to say there's so much bad news about how pervasive PFAS chemicals are in our environment, but so much good news about the efforts to test and to mitigate, to clean up, and really best of all, to stop this contamination going forward. And that's the power of this bill that Representative Gramlich has introduced that we're talking about today. Thank you for that. Now let's ask some questions. First up, you said PFAS linger in the environment for a long time. How long are we talking?
Unfortunately, a really, really long time. For many of the PFAS that have been well studied, which is a very small subset of all of them, the half-lives in the environment are, on the order of years to decades. So once a contamination occurs, and some of this contamination, for example, at the Tozier farm, they were accepting sludge deliveries and were spreading sludge for decades. And I don't know exactly when Fred Stone started, but around say 1980 or so, and in the 80s, 90s, and then the early part of this century, so that's a lot of contamination, and it's still there. There are some chemicals that can actually be subjected to things like UV degradation or biodegradation by microbes, but that's just not the case for PFAS. So we're talking likely at least decades.
That's when we focus on the power that comes from stopping that contamination going forward. So thank you. That's the flip side to that bad news. Are there any publicly available maps of areas that are contaminated, major pollution sites? How do we know? I mean, this isn't good that it's happening anywhere, but how do we know if it's happening in our own backyards?
Yeah, so, and Gail might want to chime in on this too, but the DEP does have some maps on their website. There's also an organization called the Environmental Working Group that actually tracks PFAS contamination, and they have maps on their website as well, which are helpful. So the DEP actually has a dedicated microsite dedicated to PFAS. So you can go on their website and kind of find some of that information. But like I said, the Environmental Working Group does it kind of across the country. So if you want to see what's happening in other states besides Maine, that is another good resource to find some things. And Gail, I don't know if you have other suggestions.
Yeah, if you just Google like Maine DEP PFAS, their PFAS site will come up, and there's I think they're calling it the PFAS map tracker or map, something like that. So you can actually see a map of the entire state, and it's got a dot where they have reported testing results. And they also have a specific tool right now for the Fairfield situation, which is quite useful, for me being right next door to Fairfield and working with some of the people there, where they have a dot for every single, house, every single well, some of the soil samples. And they also color coded them. So they're, red if they're high and green if they're a little bit lower. If you're willing to do that, there's some kind of jargon in that Maine DEP map. When you click on it, it'll give some sort of abbreviations of the specific chemicals. So it's a little tricky if you're not familiar with it, but you can absolutely find out, if your drinking water supplier has tested, or if you're concerned about soil in your area. And then, as Sarah mentioned, the Environmental Working Group which is an NGO, they've really filled in a gap in terms of testing drinking water specifically. And unfortunately, they found it in most of the places that they've looked.
When if folks have a private well and send their water off to be tested, is PFAS one of the things that is included in that battery of tests?
It is not. So that is for stuff like uranium and arsenic and stuff like that. PFAS is a separate test. And Gail might know a little bit more about this. There are only a couple of labs that have the testing capability for PFAS, and it unfortunately is not cheap. It is not a cheap test. I think it's around $200 or $300. So unfortunately, you kind of have to send it off to some place a little specialized. If that is something you want to do, like, you know, we are happy to kind of point you in the right direction on how to do that. But it is not something generally the state. I mean, I think they can, but like, it's not a typical test that's done.
Okay. And then you can tell this first batch of questions is really about the how is it affecting me already? So if we've been drinking Oakhurst milk, for example, is that likely to have been contaminated at some point, or how do we know? Not to throw Oakhurst under the
I wouldn't throw Oakhurst
here.
under the bus, just to be clear. The Department of Agriculture is doing spot testing, like they're testing at retail level for milk contamination. We would like to see them do more, and we would like to see them actually test at the farm level instead of the retail level, because at retail, you know, it's not just milk from one farm. It generally goes to like a vat and gets mixed up, so it gets diluted, which is good, because that means that like whatever you're getting at the retail end does not have the levels that it would be at the farm level. But yeah, I mean, for the, you know, Maine, the milk is safe. Like you can safely drink milk here in the state of Maine. The Department of Agriculture is testing that. But, you know, like I said, we would like to see them be a little bit more proactive about that and start testing at the farm level instead of the retail level to really capture where the contamination is happening, because by the time it gets to retail, it's been pretty diluted. So.
Okay.
And there are other, unfortunately, there are other categories of, you know, food and drink where PFAS has contaminated, where PFAS contamination is found. As with other environmental contaminants, especially long-term environmental contaminants that you may have heard of, like PCBs and some of these other things, they find their way into the food supply. So unfortunately, we're also eating a low level of PFAS in foods. So food and drinking water are the primary sources for like a typical American.
And how would we know if we have nonstick pans in the cupboard right now? Are they all contaminated? Should we get rid of them right away, or how do we know if they're safe?
If you just bought a nonstick pan, it probably is Teflon or a related chemical. If you maybe did some research and got a nonstick pan that uses a little, that it uses a different technology, there's sort of ceramic coated things, and I don't even know all those green products out there. But if you kind of did some research and that the type of pan was not just called nonstick, but it actually had some sort of newer technology, then you're probably okay. But if it was just a nonstick pan at the store, chances are it's Teflon.
And the other thing I would just say that you will see a lot of things that say PFOA free for pans. That is just one type of PFAS. That does not mean that pan doesn't have other type of PFAS in it. It just means it doesn't have that one type of PFAS in it. So you are better off sticking with, your cast iron skillets, ceramic, that type of things that do not have any sort of the kind of Teflon nonstick coating on it. So.
Especially because PFOA is being phased out. So that doesn't really mean anything anymore. So yeah.
Well, that's actually a great point, because we could say we want that to be true of PFAS too, right? That it's phased out and it eventually won't matter whether it says it's PFAS free, because it's impossible that PFAS could be there. So I keep trying to bring it back to the good news of this conversation today. So let's talk about that. This is work at the state level that we're talking about today. What's being done at the national level? We can't be the only people who care about this.
We are not. And I will confess that I am not as engaged on the federal level as I am on the state level. I don't know if Lori or Gail has any other information, but the federal folks are, this was part of Biden's transition memo, had a section on dealing with PFAS. The EPA is in the process of looking at water standards, and they're looking at, kind of funding for remediation. I know there's, it's different legislation that's been going through. They were trying to get the Department of Defense to move away from using AFFF firefighting foam. It used to be a requirement. It's no longer a requirement. So there are things that the federal government is doing. The states tend to lead on this though, and the federal, quite frankly, the EPA is about 50 years behind on, how they're dealing with chemicals in general. And so the states have really taken the lead on this. Washington's doing some good stuff. New York is doing some good stuff. Vermont's done some really good stuff. So the states are kind of dragging the federal government along behind them, but there are some opportunities, the Biden administration is trying to get some money, and the infrastructure bill that he wants to pass for kind of remediation and cleanup and that type of stuff. So there are things happening at the federal level. That takes a long time. Our state government works much faster, and they really kind of understand what's happening here at the state level. Whereas the federal government, is kind of focused more on like the testing and the setting standards and that type of stuff. We really want to just start moving away from it. So that's why we're taking action on the state level. So, and Gail, I don't know if you've.
I can just also quickly add that, while we wait for, phase outs, the private sector, some businesses, especially those that have, loyal customer bases who want to be healthy and they're doing recreation and stuff, they're actually moving on this. So besides phase out in ski wax, the big manufacturers of outerwear that have used Gore-Tex and other types of water resistant treatments, they're working hard. Patagonia, North Face, some of these companies are working pretty hard to come up with a fluoro-free alternative to their outerwear coatings, for example. So, I think that will be good because they're major sources of use of the chemicals and potentially exposure routes for people. But of course, ultimately, we need to just phase them out. And, there's more phase out going on in Europe than going on here. So it is possible, especially the Scandinavian countries are really interested, really focused on this issue and wanting to phase them out. So, it is possible to move legislation where you're actually going to start phasing these things out. And we need to move faster in this country. But we'll benefit to some extent from Europe's work because, like, for example, on the ski waxes, they had to be phased. The fluorochemicals had to be phased out because of European restrictions, not US restrictions. But we need to move faster in the US. And Maine's doing such a great job on the leading edge of that.
That's really great. And clearly, if they're phasing these chemicals out in Europe, there must be substitutions available, at least for a lot of the uses that we're concerned with. What kind of process is there to make sure that we don't replace PFAS with something just as bad or bad in a different way or still unsafe? Is there, Sarah, you said the EPA is pretty out of date in terms of how they deal with chemicals. What's the testing process like and approval process? Tell me there's an approval process.
I mean, there is at the federal level, but it's pretty weak. And, many of the PFAS chemicals were grandfathered into our chemicals law anyway, so they're not really subject to much safety testing. The other thing that's a little bit of a problem is the federal government really isn't poised to act on an entire family of chemicals. And really that's what needs to happen is we need to say, we're going to do some cherry picking. We're going to do some like this PFAS is worse than this, or this use of it is worse than this. That's probably inevitable, but we need to make sure that we're saying you can't just replace one with another. We did that with BPA. It was great that we got this endocrine disrupting plastics monomer out of, baby bottles, and other uses, but we first started replacing it with other BP chemicals that we didn't know anything about. And then subsequently we were like, oh gosh, bummer, there are also estrogens. That's not a good way to go. So we really need to, and Europe is poised to kind of think about this. Could we ban PFAS as a family of chemicals? Could we just ban them all? Except for the most, just the most essential uses for which we just absolutely can't think of another substitute, and for which maybe human exposure is minimal or environmental contamination is minimal, something like that. That's really where we need to go. And if we had the ability to do that, then it would be easier to think about substitutions, because you you might have the ability to, innovate and come up with a different process or chemical.
And they're doing that with PFAS anyway already. So originally there were the long chain, the 8-chain, 10-chain PFAS that were like the PFOS, PFOA, and then everybody figured out that those were toxic. And so the chemical companies went, okay, well, we have these different PFAS that are not long chain, they're short chain, they're only 6 PFAS, they're much safer, we'll use those instead. So there's, that's already happening right now, and the chemical industry will argue that their new ones are not as bioaccumulative, or they don't last as long in the environment. They still cause harm. And the EPA, like, as Gail said, they grandfathered in a whole bunch of chemicals. They do things that's called generally recognized as safe, where they basically take the industry's word that whatever they're giving them is safe, and they take industry studies and stuff like that. And so we need to overhaul how they're dealing with toxic chemicals at the federal level. For the food packaging law that we passed here in Maine, we did have some language in there that said safer alternatives. The alternatives must be safer. And so there was some definitional language around that. So, that is when we're writing legislation, we need to take that into consideration and make sure that we're adding from both a health impact and an environmental impact. There's a bill before the committee next week, the work session around hydrofluorocarbons, that they want to replace them with hydrofluoroolefins, which are more toxic to humans, but better for the environment. So we need to be careful when we're looking at alternatives, whether it's PFAS or, any sort of chemical, that what they're putting in place of it is not just as bad, or we know as much about, because that's already happening. That's been happening for years. So.
Wow, I just really appreciate how many fronts you're working on right now. I mean, the number of PFAS bills in the legislature this session alone is pretty astounding, and hard for a lot of us to keep track of. So thank you very much. It is, Sarah, you mentioned the need to address that 6-year statute of limitations. Is that specific to Maine, or is there? It sounds like we're really talking about the state level for most.
Yeah, it's a state level. So every state kind of has different discovery laws, but Maine is a little bit of an outlier. I think there's 36, if I'm remembering the number right, 36 or 37 other states that have discovery laws similar to what we're asking the legislature to do. That is before the Judiciary Committee, and like I said, that bill has pretty good bipartisan support, so we're hopeful it'll pass. That is specific to PFAS, though, to be clear. It is statute of limitations for PFAS only. This is not for other chemicals. We're only dealing with the PFAS issue in the statute of limitations bill. But, like I said, it kind of varies from state to state, so this would just be specific to Maine.
Okay. And Representative Gramlich, you talked a little bit about the funding that we need for education and other kinds of programs to help municipalities. Where does that funding come from? Is that the disclosure and reporting fee, or is there something else?
I'm sorry, Kathleen, you broke up a little bit in the middle of that and I didn't catch it. I apologize.
No, it's, is the disclosure and reporting fee specified in this bill? Is that what would fund educational programs and resources to municipalities and cleanup, or what does that go towards?
Well, in part that does, but I think that, and Sarah can jump in anytime, but I think that the educational component is a bit bigger than what my bill aims to address, because we're looking at trying to take a more strategic approach in terms of getting rid of PFAS at the source, which is great. But I think it's a bigger picture conversation that we need to collectively have in terms of this issue. Obviously, forums like this do elevate it, but there's many folks that just are not aware of the harm and the insidious nature where we find this product, which is essentially everywhere. So I think, some of the tenets, and my bill, I haven't gotten the final draft yet from our revisor's office, but some of the tenets do include some fees which cover an array of costs, but education is certainly a component. Sarah, did you want to add in anything about that?
Yeah, the reporting fee in that bill would, first off, part of it would have to go to DEP to help kind of pay for their a reporting program, like they need to they don't have really a system set up. So some of that money would go there, but then it would be kind of put into a fund for municipalities, for the education, for that type of stuff. So yes, it comes from the reporting fee. We have another bill, the other bill that we're working on with Representative Gramlich around testing, which has a fee associated with it as well. It would be a disposal fee. So for municipalities that dispose of, sludge, there would be a fee attached to it. They already pay a fee for landfilling. They don't pay a fee for spreading on farmland, which unfortunately they are still doing in some instances. So we want to attach a fee to any type of disposal for the sludge. And then that money also, part of it would go to DEP for testing, and then, to pay for some of the testing, because that is an expensive chunk of change. I think DEP said around $3 or $4 million to test the sites that are on that list. And so, some of that money would go to the testing, and then whatever, we could be left over would go towards kind of be put in another fund that would be directed towards like farmers and helping folks that are impacted. So, so there are a couple of fee things that we have set up, but we need more money. Like those are not going to generate enough money to, like I said, Fred Stone's farm alone is probably millions of dollars for cleanup. Tozier Farm is probably just as bad, if not worse. And as we start getting, like, we need money. We need the federal government to cough out some funds, but at the same time, we also, quite frankly, need to put the chemical companies on the hook for the cleanup here. Like, they should be responsible for paying for this. It should not be the farmers, it should not be the municipalities. The statute of limitations bill will help with that a little bit. It would be nice. We would like to see the state of Maine join some of these other class action lawsuits that some of the other states are doing to go after these chemical companies to get the money. That has not happened yet, but that is another thing that we would like to see happen.
Again, so many fronts that this battle is being fought on, and we are so grateful to you, Sarah, to you, Gail, to you, Representative Gramlich, for the expertise and the passion and the organizing that you bring to this work. You've done a huge service towards that educational effort today, and we're really grateful. As I said earlier, everybody will get a follow-up email this afternoon with links to a fact sheet about the bill we discussed specifically today, but also have Sarah's contact information, so it'll be easy to reach out and get updates on some of the other bills that are extremely relevant here. Oh, and Sarah just put her email in the chat. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. We are now in the month of April, which means we are in our 1-year anniversary of the weekly Lunch and Learn series. It has been a real highlight for me to see each of your wonderful faces each week. So thank you. I hope you can join us next week. We'll do another deep dive into another one of our Environmental Priorities Coalition priorities. Next week, advancing equitable recycling reform with extended producer responsibility. There's a real theme here about making the folks who are causing the problems accountable for fixing them. So see you then. Thank you all. Have a beautiful weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.